Our speaker tonight, Brandon Wark, you all know him, you love him. He's one of the best liberty activists in Colorado. He created Free State Colorado. He runs Liberty on the Rocks, NOCO, and he's the best RV salesman on the Front Range. Give it up, Brandon Wark.
Thank you very much, Josh. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Well, awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. This is Colorado's premier Liberty meetup. I mean, Liberty on the Rocks is such a great place, such a great community where you can meet like-minded, liberty-minded individuals, and there's not a lot of places like that these days. So super thankful for this opportunity. What do you guys think about the weather today, huh? Beautiful, nice, right? We got a couple more days of 70s, but I don't know if you saw Friday, Saturday, we're going to get some cold weather coming in. It's going to get rainy. It's going to get cloudy. We're going to get snow up in the high country. You know, clouds are coming. Winter's coming, right? And you know, a lot of people think that that's where our society's going. They think the clouds are coming. They think it's getting darker. They think the storms are on the horizon. You know, people think of the wars, these assassination attempts, the economic lockdowns on our society, the control of the big banks, all of these things. There's reasons not to be too optimistic as a libertarian these days, right? But I am optimistic. And my hope is tonight that you leave with some of that optimism, that you have that sense of hope, that a libertarian world is possible. Libertarian revolution is possible. What do you guys think? Do you think there's a hope for a libertarian society in our lifetime? Anybody? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. Maybe on some level. You know, what do people think of revolution, right? Pitchforks and torches, tar and feathers, maybe an armor-plated bulldozer going down Granby, 3D printed firearms used in Myanmar, you know, black masks, Molotov cocktails. These are kind of the things people think of when they think of revolution. You know, and there's some truth to that, right? There's some truth to that when we look around the world and the history of it. But, you know, there's really more to revolution than that. You know, does anybody think that a libertarian revolution is inevitable? Is it inevitable? Is it something that's maybe going to happen? Well, maybe, maybe not. But a revolution itself is inevitable, right? I mean, we look at the history of the world. We look at how much has changed over the years. And it's easy for us in our short lives to see a government program or see an institution form and think it's going to be there forever, right? We really think, oh my gosh, this is it. They've taken away this right from us forever and ever. But nothing lasts forever. So revolution is inevitable on some level, but it's up to people to make it a libertarian revolution. You know, no government or empire or authoritarian regime lasts forever. So let's see, what can we expect for a libertarian revolution? Let's take a look. Let's start with defining our terms. You know, these are standard dictionary definitions of ideas. This is fundamentally what we're talking about. And I really want to talk about some big picture, bird's eye view, and then we'll get into some details as we go along. So revolution, a fundamental change in political organization. I added political power as well, because sometimes power can exist outside of an organization. Libertarian, a philosophy, a political philosophy that advocates only minimal state intervention in the free market and the private lives of citizens. So that's really what we're talking about. So I want to break it down. I like looking at things from a temporal perspective, you know. If we're looking towards the future, we got to look at the past a little bit. And we got to analyze the present. Where are we at? How are we going to get there? Where did we come from? So let's start our exploration of the idea of the libertarian revolution by looking at this past that we've all learned about over the years. You know, like I said, human history has seen countless revolutions, and I want to talk about a few of those to give us some insights into our future. 1776, right? As Americans, a lot of us really hang on to that idea. We see this Tea Party movement, you know, seizing on this idea. We're going to rebel against the crown. We're going to exert our right to self-determination. You know, that's a really strong idea in American culture, and I think it's something that needs to be cultivated and strengthened as we go on. But you know, why did it succeed? You know, how did the colonials achieve victory against the great British Empire? You know, these are lessons that future libertarian revolutionaries should learn well. I think one of the key components there is being an ocean away, right? When it took weeks, when it took months to get reinforcements across the seas, to get somebody there, to send that tax collector, you know, somebody, if you know 2 months in advance, a tax collector is coming on a ship, you can make some plans. You can move your operation away, you can hide the money, you can do a lot of things, right? Coalitions. I mean, that was a big thing, right? I mean, the French, natives, Native Americans, other people were really working with the American colonialists, the revolutionaries, to help them in their goal to secede from the United Kingdom. Organization. I think this is really important, and it's a hard pill to swallow for most libertarians, but the idea that there were functioning state governments, there were already decentralized governments that existed that had power structure outside of the British Crown, that can be used to facilitate the civil society that so many people relied on. Because those existed, it allowed for them to replace, at that local level, a decentralized level, what the British government was trying to do in an international level. And identity, I think that's a huge part of it as well. You know, when you think about it, Europeans started coming to America back in the 1600s, so you really have 174 years, generations, right? It's like not a lot of these people were necessarily fresh off the boat. People grew up here and had a sense of identity of what it meant to be Americans. So they didn't have a lot of loyalty to the crown, right? Now I'm talking about some basic ideas, but I think it's going to come together a little bit later. That idea specifically about identity is something I want to keep talking about. Let's talk about 1861, AKA the American Civil War, America's second war of secession. You know, the South attempted to exercise their right to secede, but ultimately it lost the conflict and was captured by the North. Thankfully, though, even though the Southern states failed, some good came from the war, the abolition of slavery. The abolition was already in progress before the war, but thankfully it was expedited and more people were able to gain their freedom. But nonetheless, why did the South fail? Well, think about that distance problem, right? You're close with the proximity. There's no natural barrier, right? I mean, you can march down to get to Virginia from across from Maryland pretty dang easily. You don't have a whole ocean to cross. The technology as well. I mean, that's a key component I think we need to recognize in a lot of this historical context and also our future context. The North had the weapons. They had the industrial machinery, right? What do? I mean, think about Europeans versus Native Americans, for example. Who had the weapons? Who had the technology to really succeed in their war? A lack of support as well. There was a public relations failure on the part of the South because, of course, you had the slavery issue, you had this Southern governments, these state governments that weren't necessarily tied into the global status quo like the Northern government was. So, you know, the French kind of lost support. They supported them for a little bit and then kind of fell apart from that. Europe, Britain, France, they kind of lost some of the appetite for supporting the South. So when you think about it that way, kind of the contrast between 76 and 61, I think it paints an interesting picture that we need to recognize. Let's move on to the 60s, the social revolution, a revolution that we're still existing within. I was talking earlier, and the revolution has already been foisted upon us in so many ways. We're living in this cultural revolution. I don't know if anybody here has heard of Lily Tang Williams. She was a former here in Colorado. I met her at Liberty on the Rocks many, many moons ago. She's out in New Hampshire running for Senate this year. But she came from China and is very pro-American, pro-liberty, very libertarian-minded individual. She ran as a libertarian for U.S. Senate back then here in Colorado. So she really understands the cultural revolution. And I just wanted to read a quote from her. This is from last year. She goes, "I call it the American cultural revolution. Similar to Mao's cultural revolution, I survived. It is terrifying. It keeps me up at night. Most scary part is 80% people in this country don't even know it. I've been trying to give my warnings. I'm running for Congress to stop it." So of course, I think, you know, as libertarians, we recognize these power dynamics at play. We recognize how a lot of these different issues, serious issues with validity, were used by cultural Marxists and others who had an authoritarian agenda to institute their control over the political system. You talk about civil rights, the Vietnam protests, the sexual revolution and feminism, anti-capitalism. And I'm not saying all these things are bad, of course, but for the most part, they were tools. They were ideas, weaponized ideas used by an elite intellectual class to gain the control and the means of our political system. You know, I think that's a really important lesson that we need to understand because we're still living in this cultural, social revolution. Now, I talked about identity when it came to the American Revolution, and I do believe the identity aspect of it is what has made this authoritarian left so successful in our society today. And not just the left, the right as well. But this identity of victimhood, right? It's easy to say, I'm going to help you. You're a victim. You're weak, but I'm strong, and I'll help you. I'll move you. I'll bring you into the right place, the right direction. I'll help you solve the problems that you're experiencing. It's not your fault you're poor. It's not your fault you're discriminated against, but I can help you. Give me political power. Give me control over your life and the lives of others, and I will bring vengeance upon those who have harmed you, right? It's a powerful narrative. It's a powerful narrative that cannot be ignored. It's something we have to grapple with. It's something we have to understand if we ever want to create a libertarian society. This identity of victimhood is a powerful thing, and we see it play out in every day of our lives right now. Another revolution, one of the most important, I think, in our modern time that really gives a glimpse of what a more libertarian kind of society can be is the fall of USSR. You know, in 1991, a lot of people were shocked around the world when it happened. And I'd say, the failure of the economic system, where the central planning totally failed to provide a good life for people out there, is key. This lack of free markets really created a society of total proletariats, where people didn't have the means to live their lives, to be healthy and take care of their families. Part of the reason why it failed. There was also an alternative vision. American culture, back from the, post-World War II era to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the Beatles going to the USSR, people being able to watch Hollywood movies. People were able to see what a supermarket was like, right? That famous story, I don't remember who it was, Gorbachev or somebody, that came to the US and couldn't believe the abundance that we had in the United States. So why did the USSR fail? Why did it fall? Why did that revolution succeed? Well, ultimately, those things were important, but it was a palace coup, ultimately, I would say. Just like during Lenin's days, it was a coup where individuals at the top made the decision to change. And this is a really interesting concept. You may have heard of the idea of elite theory, or this bureaucracy that James Burnham talks about a lot, and I think that's something I want to get into here in a minute. But nonetheless, these are lessons from the past and help us guide us to the future of liberty. So let's look at where we're at now. Right? We looked at the past, revolutions that have succeeded and failed. What has it led us to? Where are we at? Well, I'd say we're in a very fractured world these days, right? And that can be scary for a lot of people. Like I said, people see a storm coming. People are scared out there. A lot of people are really worried about the future of our world, right? Libertarians included. We have a fractured status quo where people don't necessarily adhere to the same values. We have this balkanized identity of what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a woman, right? You've seen that going around. What does it mean to be whoever you are? Have anybody heard of the cathedral, that term? To quote, the cathedral is just a short way to say journalism plus academia, right? They're kind of one of the big villains now that the right sees, that the left has exercised this power by controlling journalism and academia in our society. So I'd say, in other words, the intellectual institutions at the center of modern society. And this is a quote from Curtis Yarvin, I believe. The intellectual institutions at the center of modern society, just as the church was the intellectual institution at the center of medieval society, but the label is making a point. The Catholic Church is one institution, but the cathedral is many institutions, yet the label is singular. So it's very interesting to see that this power is there. Of course, we see the populist left, right? We see the Antifa types, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, who have 5 members serving in our state legislature. All the BLM type protesters, the Antifa types. But it's interesting that I think they're mirrored on the populist right. Right? I would say the MAGA movement in general is this populist movement on the right. You also get a lot of Republican influencers and activists who are really tapping into that populist spirit on the right side. And there's the regime, of course. I do separate them from the cathedral. I see them more as that political establishment. You're talking about NATO, the UN, you're talking about Washington, D.C., the British government, all these types of big, heavy hitters when it comes to foreign policy and international relations. There's a big current of nihilism as well in our society. A lot of young people have nothing to believe in. They don't see any hope. They don't see any place to go. They're so inundated and overwhelmed with the information at their fingertips that they don't really latch on to a specific ideology or a specific belief system. Then we have us libertarians here, these skeptics of the status quo. People who are questioning the system and seeing where there's an opportunity to potentially make inroads to liberty. So that's kind of just a brief overview of where we're at, I would say. I think one of the biggest questions that the libertarian movement or the libertarian community has to grapple with is, how can you win? How can you gain a libertarian society? How can you lead this libertarian revolution without seizing the means of control, right? We see the world we're in now. We see the left and the right. We see the Democrats. We see the Republicans. We see all these different entities fighting over power, right? Fighting over power of our lives. Libertarians don't want to see that, right? We want to see a world where there's not that power system over our lives. And I think this is one of the most compelling questions that we have to answer as libertarians looking for a libertarian revolution. The right wants power to control us. The left wants power to control us. How can the libertarians compete? Like Orrin McIntyre says, the side that wants to win always beats the side that wants to be left alone, right? You just want to stay at home. You want to close your door. You want to work on your garden. You want to do all these amazing things, good things, things worthy of your time and energy. But at the same time, if you're not out there organizing, if you're not out there willing to compete on that playing field, then what do you do when they come after you? How do you overcome this obstacle of power dynamics? And I don't even know. I think that's one of the biggest questions to grapple, the biggest unknown in creating this libertarian revolution. Let's come up with some ideas here and see what we can do. Another key component of our present world, and I think something that's given a lot of people, a lot of libertarians hope, is this technology that we have now. The internet, right? A lot of us in here grew up with the internet or maybe didn't have it when we were really young. And just this incredible thing, oh my gosh. And that's how I became a libertarian. I was reading articles online. I think so many of us, maybe it was a YouTube video, maybe it was for me it was LouRockwell.com, reading these articles and getting exposed to new ideas. So it's really exciting that this new marketplace of ideas of the internet is allowing us this key to decentralizing the power that these other players have that we saw on the previous slide. Cryptocurrency, of course, a favorite topic around Liberty on the Rocks. This freedom of exchange, this idea that we can act in a market way without using Federal Reserve notes, without the government controlling our currency. 3D printing, of course, a great talk a couple months ago, big deal there. And I would say air travel. I think it's something that's so neglected these days that we don't talk about it, but just the idea that you can get on a plane and within a couple hours be in a totally different political jurisdiction. You can escape to freedom, that's a real possibility. A lot of us don't realize how much power we have as individuals these days compared to even 20, 30, 40, really 50 years ago, though, where you really couldn't escape. You couldn't go far. And now it's easy to create a whole new life in a whole nother country. And we see that trend a lot in the libertarian movement these days. But technology is a double-edged sword, right? So we think of technology in the hands of the state. The flip side of all of those things is the surveillance state we live in. The big banks that control our money supply and this surveillance over our bank accounts. The gun control and this really power differential when it comes to weapons. And the idea that the state has bigger guns than we do. We hear that all the time when there's talk of some sort of libertarian revolution, right? Well, they're just going to use an F-16 to blow up your house. Propaganda. It's a topic that maybe, we think we've made some inroads on, I do. But the state still has the grip, the control over so many minds of people in our society these days. So that's kind of a really brief glimpse of the past, or the present. So we looked at the past, we looked at the present, but really the important part, why we're all here tonight, is talk about the future. What lessons can we glean from where we've been and where we're at to plot a course, to draw on the map to freedom? So some different topics, some different ideas, some strategies and components of these different ideas to see how they can help guide us towards this libertarian future. I want to talk a little bit about the political progress. I know that's a dirty word for a lot of libertarians. A lot of people don't want to engage. They don't see the point. They don't see the hope that it provides. However, I would say there's incremental wins that have been powerful and have been successful in our lives. Look at Amendment 64. Colorado was the first state besides Washington in the country to legalize cannabis back in 2012. I mean, that's a massive win for a political freedom. You talk to some of these people who've been fighting since the 60s and the 70s for that issue, and they would never believe it'll never happen. It'll never legalize marijuana. It's too much is at stake. They'll never do it. And here we are now, without fear of arrest. People having insane amounts of marijuana, like our good friends in the back often do. Look at Tabor as well. If you're not familiar, not Mark, maybe Mark, but we talk about Tabor, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. It's one of the most revolutionary things that happened here in Colorado. It really is that gold standard. It is that thing that has really fundamentally kept us as free as we are and has provided as much economic prosperity. There's studies about how much wealthier Colorado is than other states, looking at since Tabor was enacted in 1992 till now. It has made a real difference. And that's why the politicians hate it. That's why it's one of the party planks of the Democratic Party. Like, that's their party platform. 1, repeal Tabor. Like, just 2 words, that's it. That's one of their biggest things they fight because it constrains them. It prevents them from keeping all of our money, spending it how they want, and it's worth fighting for. It is a win. Just 2 years ago, Proposition 122, the natural medicine. We had some speakers here then talking about it. That's game-changing. Psilocybin, peyote, these other types of substances. I mean, who would have thought? Oh my gosh! Like, could you believe it? You thought marijuana was never going to be legal. Now all of a sudden we have these natural medicines legal, or you can have that on your person without fear of being locked up for the rest of your life in Colorado. I mean, that is game-changing. It is a win for liberty. Look at Thomas Massey and Ron Paul. I mean, how many people I've met over the years who've become libertarians because of Ron Paul. So at the very least, this political program, this political effort can provide a leadership or a torch of liberty, a flame to light in the minds of men, right? Tax decreases. Just this year, North Dakota and Michigan are voting to eliminate property taxes across the state. I mean, that's incredible. Imagine you actually own your house. You don't have to pay rent to the government every 6 months. That's game changing. It's possible. It's a possible win. And Javier Milei, chainsawing the government, slashing the government bureaucracy. You know, menos Marx, más Mises. Individuals can make a difference on the political sphere, really when we focus on that local level, when we focus down at that decentralized. I mean, look at what Ron Paul has done. You know, there's a good quote out there from Ryan McMacken. He goes, "You think there's a lot of socialism now? Just imagine life without Ron Paul. Imagine, you know, you don't think you did a lot, but maybe you did. You just reached that one person. That change occurs one person at a time." You know, McMacken also says the real purpose of participating in these institutions is to destroy them. And there is some truth in that possibility by working through the political system. So some of the strategies around politics, you know, let's get some of the meat and potatoes here. We want to see how are we going to use politics to create a libertarian society, right? Nullification, that's been a big topic for decades now in the libertarian movement. Anybody heard of the 10th Amendment Center? Or Tom Woods' great book, Nullification. This idea that the states have rights, that they have power over their own locality, separate from the federal government. So, of course, we see this big fight these days is immigration, right? Sanctuary state, sanctuary city status, where you literally have the government of Colorado, the city of Denver saying, we're not cooperating with federal law enforcement when it comes to issues of immigration. I mean, regardless of what you think, that is the power of nullification. That's the power of a local government refusing to participate in a system that they disagree with at the federal level. Cannabis is the same thing. We see that with marijuana. I mean, for the longest time, that was the big worry. When marijuana was legalized in 2012, they said, oh my gosh, but the feds are going to come in, right? The DEA and the ATF, they're going to be raiding people. They're going to be arresting people left and right. They're going to be shutting down these dispensaries. But they didn't. It didn't work that way. It was true nullification at that level where the state says, we are not following federal laws related to these issues. The voters have spoken. And that's a real possibility, a real victory for liberty. Think about guns, sanctuary counties, sanctuary communities, you know, the Second Amendment sanctuaries, they call them, where some of these local officials, local sheriffs say, hey, up here in our rural community, we're not going to enforce whatever type of gun law you pass down in Denver. Doesn't matter what you do, you're going to have to send the state police to come enforce those laws because we're not participating at the local level. That is power. That is real, true liberty society, right? Well, that's one. Two is restricting voting. Now, I know that may seem strange, right, to a lot of people, maybe not to everybody in the room, but this idea of restricting voting to only certain people, right? Why should people who don't pay taxes vote on tax increasing measures, right? If you don't own property, why should you be voting on property taxes? You're voting to steal somebody else's hard-earned income for some social program or special interest that you believe in, but it's not your property that's being taxed. I mean, how is that fair? How is that right? One of the people who really popularized this idea recently is a hero on the libertarian right, I guess you would say, the whole Mises Institute and all these people, is Hans Hermann Hoppe. What Must Be Done is a great pamphlet. He's written some good books. I'll talk about one of his books here in a minute, but I just want to read this one line because he has a strategy in terms of restricting voting as a strategy to achieve a libertarian society. First, from the impossibility of a top-down strategy, it follows that one should expend a little or no energy, time or money on nationwide political contests, such as presidential elections, and also not on contests for central government in particular. Less effort on senatorial races than on House races, for instance. Skip ahead a little bit here, but I think that's important. Focus on that local level. Basically, he says, everything else follows almost automatically from the ultimate goal, which must be kept permanently in mind in all of one's activities, the restoration from the bottom up of private property, and the right to property protection, the right to self-defense, to exclude or include into freedom of contract. And the answer can be broken down into two parts. First, what to do within these very small districts where a pro-private property candidate and anti-majoritarian personality can win. And second, how to deal with the higher levels of government, and especially with the central federal government. So on the local level, he believes the first central plank of one's platform should be one must attempt to restrict the right to vote on local taxes, in particular on property taxes and regulations to property and real estate owners. Only property owners must be permitted to vote, and their vote is not equal, but in accordance with the value of the equity owned and the amount of taxes paid. So if you can get to that point where you only have property owners voting on property taxes, what do you think is going to happen? Are they going to vote to lower taxes? Are they going to vote to maybe say, hey, listen, I own 90% of the property in this community, I get 90% of the votes, and I don't want all you people taking my property away from me, of course that's going to happen. But it only happens by restricting that voting. So it's an interesting strategy. I think it's a strategy that has captured the imagination of a lot of people, but is nonetheless not necessarily politically popular. Also moving on to decentralization and secession. Leave the governments that don't represent you, right? So there's Ryan McMacken, I mentioned already previously, a great book called Breaking Away, The Case for Secession, Radical Decentralization, and Smaller Polities. So the idea of breaking it up, moving down to smaller and smaller local levels of government. If we can do that and break up the bigger stuff and get to that smaller level, we can really have those victories for freedom there. I hope everybody can see that. Secession, decentralization. But I think one of the key components is that political leadership, this elite theory, this study of the managerial class. If you don't have people at the top who are interested in participating in this libertarian revolution, then how do you do anything about it? So these are some different components, different strategies, maybe competing strategies. Maybe they don't overlap necessarily. Maybe they disagree with each other on some level. But I feel like these 4 strategies are key components for any political activists in the libertarian world. And really, it's ultimately about the identity of self-ownership, right? We talked about the identity of victimhood, but the identity of self-ownership, right? Where you own yourself, you own your own property. What can people do at that level? But also self-ownership is a part of a community identity. You know, think of the colonists who saw themselves as Americans and not as the British. So having that sense of identity at the local level, that I'm a Coloradan maybe, not an American, maybe I'm a Virginian, not an American, you think of it that way, there's some opportunity there as well. I think that's a key component of that strategy. I think identity is tied into all of this, ultimately. So some great books on political liberty as well. Talked about a few of them already, but nonetheless, there's plenty out there. This is probably one of the biggest focuses for a lot of people in liberty activism that I've met, is this political aspect, but it's not the only aspect. It's not the most important one necessarily. I would say you have to fight at the local level politically. We saw what happened during COVID, right? I mean, we saw how easy it was for them to shut down our society, how to come after us, how to shut down our businesses, our churches, how to restrict our rights as individuals. If we don't fight at the local level or fight at the political level at all, then how can we stop that? How can we push back against that type of thing? I hope that's a lesson we've learned in the last 20 years, and by we, I mean the liberty community, that you have to engage at least some level of politics just for pure self-defense reasons, if nothing else, right? You don't want to get lined up against the wall and shot. That's the alternative getting involved in politics without trying to sound too hyperbole there. But let's talk a little bit about culture. You know, politics is one thing, wins are possible there. It's a short-term battle. The problem with politics is you can pass a great law, right? And then 2 years later, it can be repealed. Or they can pass another tax. And, hey, we repealed the tax on food. A year later, they repass it. So politics is a short-term game. It's not a long-term game. You can't win in the long game fighting only in the political battle. But it is a necessary fight, because if we don't fight at the political level, we might not make it to the long-term fights we can get to. So for culture, for example, I think culture is huge, right? They're talking about the culture war these days, this cultural battle that we have. But ultimately, if we're going to create a libertarian society, it's got to be a society of cultural libertarians, where people have a sense of identity around this idea of self-responsibility, personal responsibility, self-ownership. Don't tread on me. Leave me alone. I can do what I want. I am the person who's the best capable of making decisions over my life, right? And I think, you know, for lack of a better word, drugs plays a key component in that. You know, you have a new generation of people growing up in this world where cannabis and psychedelics are legal. They're becoming more accepted. But that also means there's a new era of personal responsibility, because if you aren't responsible for yourself, if you don't engage in this sense of personal responsibility, where are you going to end up? Well, you can walk down the block here in Denver, right outside our building out here, and see where you end up if you don't exercise that level of personal responsibility, right? Guns. There was a couple studies I found. There's an 8% increase in the past 9 years in people under 35 years old in gun ownership. So, you know, I think it's really this post-COVID world. If you go back further, the statistics aren't great. If you talk back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but I think recently, hopefully, there's a change in the youth culture to say guns are cool, right? Guns are great to have. They're important to have. We see the crime. We can't count on people to save us. We must save ourselves. So really playing that game of developing gun ownership and youth culture, I think, is important. Of course, the internet and media, online culture generally is very anti-authoritarian. It's this exposure to new ideas and realities. goes without really talking about. Influencers, comedians, content creators. This new media will determine the future. So often people say, well, why? Why do people have this authoritarian mindset? Why do people buy into the status quo? When you see it on the nightly news every single night, when you get on your phone and that's the same thing you see over and over again, of course people believe that, right? You believe what you're exposed to. That's how most people act. We repeat what we're told. We see the same thing over and over again, and that becomes what we believe. That becomes the world in which we live in. So somebody who can undermine the status quo, these influencers or comedians or content creators who can put out a cool little video on TikTok, it makes people question something. I think that's where a lot of the battle is. But also replacing the state. I mean, that's the culture there. Churches, families, institutions, groups, organizations. I mean, even Liberty on the Rocks. You have these groups and places. I mean, you think back when people had the sense of identity of belonging to the Elks or the Masons or these other types of groups out there. It's a society outside of state control. It's a community of people who count on each other, who work with each other, who trust each other, totally without the government being involved whatsoever. If we want to replace the state, there needs to be a fostering and development of more communities of people outside of the state itself. Too many people are turning to the state to be their community. You think about like the Tuttle Twins, literature, art. There's so much out there these days that really helps us move in that direction. So looking at some of those books, I'd say the Little House on the Prairie books, believe it or not, I think are extremely libertarian from a perspective of, what it's like to live on your own out in the wilderness and how you're responsible for your own destiny and you really got to make your own way in the world. Of course, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand. If anybody has not read the Doug Casey and John Hunt series, the High Ground series, it is phenomenal. It's this new libertarian fiction series. It is great. This libertarian hero kind of carving his own way in the world. Definitely a model for people to live by these days. Tuttle Twins, great books in science fiction as well. Enemy of the State by F. Paul Wilson. L. Neil Smith's The Probability Broach. Just different ideas, different things that show what a libertarian culture would be like. I think that's really an important key component of fiction, right? How much dystopian literature is out there these days? How much zombie movies and all these things about this authoritarian, terrible world? But where's this presentation of what a libertarian society would look like? Well, thankfully, it can be found in some of these books. And I would even say, patriot and survival literature. There's some value there as well because it really paints a picture that you're on your own, nobody's coming to save you, you got to figure things out, and don't trust the government. So that's kind of where we're at on a cultural level from my perspective. Let's talk a little bit about technology and what that can mean. Now, this might seem like a big dream, but it's Elon Musk's dream, and he's definitely accomplishing quite a bit. But the space travel, escaping the tyranny of Earth, and that's really something that's captured the idea of libertarian authors and philosophers for a long time. From The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein to one of my other favorite authors, L. Neil Smith, Pallas, creating a libertarian society on an asteroid, orbiting a planet. If you can do that, if you're a billionaire tech oligarch and you can build a community outside of the government's control and institute libertarian values, hey, maybe that's the future we're moving towards. But technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used to oppress us as well as free us. But we got to consider the invention of the printing press led to the proliferation of the pamphleteers in colonial America who helped spread the message and build a network of dissidents, or the White Rose during the Nazi occupation, and of course the use of Twitter during the Arab Spring. Not only that, but the use of 3D printed guns in Southeast Asia and the Myanmar Civil War. New technology can provide opportunities for individuals to have more control over their own lives. Weapons. 3D printed drugs, that's going to be one of the next frontiers, I believe. You can have the base chemicals, and then 3D print the drugs in your basement and make whatever you want. I mean, that's coming. The drug war is going to be over just like the war on guns is nearly over with 3D printed firearms. Of course, you have privacy technology. A great resource for that is libertytools.io. Definitely check that out, where you can find a lot of good stuff there. But even private communication, the ability for people to communicate. I mean, has anybody experienced what Twitter was like before Elon Musk bought it and what it was like afterwards? I mean, it's incredible. It's power, right? And that's really something that needs to be recognized and fostered, ultimately, to create these tools for liberty. And I'd say even personal medical technology, because I think one of the state's biggest grips on people, especially maybe even older people, is the control of the medical industry. This idea that you have to go through all these licensing schemes, that you can only go to certain groups, and they control how insurance can be used, and they drive up the costs everywhere. The government has its hands so much in medicine that if this new medical technology can be held at a personal level in your own home, you can escape that medical industrial complex and take away that tool of the state. So those are just some of the ideas there. Similar ideas with the books, a lot of science fiction. a lot of stuff. One of my favorites is Werner Vinge's Across Real Time. Is a collection of 3 stories. But the middle story, The Ungoverned, is absolutely phenomenal because it shows a perspective from basically somebody who owns a farm. And in this future society, nuclear weapons are pretty common. So they basically live in this farmland, and if they're invaded, they have weapons to defend themselves. If all is lost and they know they're going to be taken out, they just activate the nuclear bomb and irradiate the land, kill everybody within a mile or two, and nobody messes with them, right? Armed society is a polite society. I mean, it may seem extreme, but nonetheless, the power of technology. When we think about it, though, you think about what prevents wars, right? Are you going to go to war with another nuclear power? Probably not. If you can avoid it, hopefully, if you're sane, if you're rational, you're not going to, because there's the lack of power differential, right? We see the U.S. government historically preying upon countries that don't have the ability to fight back. I do believe that's really the main reasons we went into Iraq is because we knew they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, because if they did, we wouldn't have gone there. When Gaddafi got rid of his weapons of mass destruction in Libya, it wasn't many years later that he was taken out. If he maintained the capability to launch chemical weapons into Europe, probably would have been left alone a little bit longer. That's the reality of the world we live in, like it or not. But nonetheless, some interesting books about how technology can help free us. So those are some of those ideas there, but I would say, I keep harping on this idea, and I think ultimately, a lot of this has to be in service to identity. I think it's probably the most important tool of the authoritarian system. Think of how those on the extreme left or right recruit people, right? Race, gender, class. This idea of, hey, nobody's looking out for you, but we're part of your group and we'll look out for you. I mean, we see it. This is how gangs work, right? And government's just a gang writ large. It's a very, very powerful technique. And it's something that libertarians really need to understand if we want to overcome it. But I think there's an opportunity there, ultimately, because this lack of identity that people have is really because of this loss of faith in institutions. I mean, look at all the polls. People trust the media even less. If you can believe it, they trust them less this year than last year. How is that even possible? Government, schools, Hollywood, political parties, people hate them. Nobody trusts them. Nobody believes them. And then when you talk about social media exposing this corruption, showing all the money they have and how these claims that they make and how they fail to adhere to it, and then they become multimillionaires off of being elected to Congress, I mean, people have no trust. Community. That's another sense of identity as well. I think this post-COVID world, this lack of community is really important. This idea of who am I? This lack of personal or family history. People don't have that. You ask your great-grandfather who he was. So I'm an Irish Catholic, descendant of these people. I can tell you the whole backstory about who and what I am, and that really defines my identity. You ask a young person now who they are, they're going to tell you some made-up gobbledygook probably that their public school teacher taught them, or they're not even going to know, right? Or they'll just make something up. But I really do believe this all comes down to selling identity. Who has the best story will win in the long term. The future is up for grabs. Who will win out? I think it's the person who can create that best idea of identity, really, because ultimately that's what's going to get into the minds of individuals to guide their lives forward. So let's bring it all together here. Let's kind of look at it here from these different perspectives. So there's the political battle. I see that as the real short-term fight, this necessary vigilance. Like I said, you don't want to be lined up against the wall. That's why we engage in politics, to fight against COVID mandates. It's a short-term fight that is necessary, as much as we don't want it to be, as much as we have better things to do. This short-term battle, we can't afford not to fight it. But ultimately, if we're not fighting the long-term battle, our short-term victories become nothing in the end. So this long-term change and this social change over generations, that's part of what we're living through now with this cultural revolution. And that really is centered in identity, I would say. Technology, empowering individuals, giving power to society away from the state. Albert J. Nock talked about how do you fight against state power? Well, it's really social power. Those are the two competing things, right? Because if you have social groups and organizations helping each other out, a hurricane comes through your community and you don't need FEMA, they're not going to be there anyway. Maybe they're going to be a detriment to your community, but you have a community of people already that you can work with from your church, from your social organizations, from your school, whatever it is, from your neighborhood. They're going to survive a lot better and you're going to thrive a lot better than most other people. So you fight where you can win on that political level and all these levels. Create these families and clubs to promote a liberty identity. Use these tools in service of creating identity. Think of the Free State Project in New Hampshire, or the idea of creating independent communities of liberty-minded individuals. Those are some of the models, I think, that kind of start bringing this all together. So, what does this look like? What does this look like for individuals? What is this liberty lifestyle? Has anybody heard of this idea called agorism? The idea that you act in a market capacity outside of state regulation, right? So think of a flea market, think of a garage sale, think of the black market, which is the true free market, where you're buying and selling things the government wants to regulate and control, but you don't care. More of that starves the state. You know, if you can buy and sell all your goods without paying taxes, you can create these markets that exist outside of state control. Ultimately, that's a viable strategy towards creating this libertarian revolution. But also being prepared to survive and thrive. You know, this post-collapse organization, we're seeing it all across the world where societies are collapsing, governments are collapsing. Imagine if we knew. Imagine if the Soviets knew in 5 years their country was going to collapse, or Yugoslavia, or so many other places in Africa, or even in the United States. We know in 5 years our governmental system, I mean, every day you turn on the news, it seems like we're one step closer to total lack of legitimacy and total collapse of this federal government system. So being prepared, having this post-collapse organization, prepping food production, all of those types of things. You know, what would happen if the government fell tomorrow? Who would fill the vacuum? Think of it that way. What about Gulch? Also, that's a really important key I think I'd bring up here in terms of what we talked about, the difference between the American Revolution and the Civil War. Because Gulch was in the mountains. It was hard to find. They had like a force field over them, if you remember the book, like it made them invisible basically. But it was that physical barrier that really was important, I think. That there's a necessity there on some level. But also just opting out of the state-controlled systems and creating a bubble. What if you could live in a society or live in a community where you just totally were able to buy, sell, trade, work, and interact with people totally outside of the governmental system? I mean, that's already a libertarian revolution right there. And community. You know, as libertarians, we often don't think of the sense of community, but, you know, you might be able to survive alone, but you definitely cannot thrive alone. And that's so important. Looking at it that way. So let's talk about the timeline. What could a libertarian revolution look like, you know? First step is these political fights. It's immediate and it's constant. I hate to say it, but that's not going away anytime soon, right? But then there's the cultural battle that's going on in the background, teaching kids, teaching them to shoot guns, to question the state, to raise chickens, you know, building these institutions and events outside of state control, building farmers markets that spontaneously meet, the spontaneous order of agorist communities, building an identity of what it means to be a free person. And then along the way, you have these technological breakthroughs, these things that empower individuals to have more control over their own lives. Then, you know, if your community starts getting big enough, if you start getting a strong sense of identity and some luck, you can have some secessionary movements, you know. But I do think you need successful and widely popular movements in general. And of course, you need some political leadership. I mean, that's one of the biggest things we got to overcome. So a secessionary movement could succeed, and then a widespread libertarian culture in the long term. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, to create a true libertarian revolution. The libertarian identity has the majority of people attached to it. But ultimately, it comes down to creating this alternative vision, this necessity. Think of South Korea and North Korea. You know, North Korea has to become a prison to prevent people from defecting, or the Berlin Wall, you know. There's really a fun science fiction book as well where it's called Voyage from Yesteryear, where some people are sent out, they're raised on this planet, truly believe in the ideas of the American founding and the American Revolution. So they're a free market, independent-minded people, total like society with very low level of government. And then eventually the ship from Earth catches up to them, which is generations behind. And these people have been living on this ship coming from a very authoritarian society for a long, long time. They land on the planet, say, take us to your leader. Who's running this in a society? They say, we don't have that. We don't have this organized political structure. It's not necessary. And they try and institute some control over the society. But eventually, all these people from the ship who came light years away start defecting. They start just joining the community, because why should they stick with this strict regimental regime where the food isn't very good, where the lifestyle's not very good, where you don't really have as much opportunity, and you have this thriving marketplace, this thriving community of individuals living wealthy lives of prosperity. If we can create that alternative vision and get people to defect, that's one of the lessons, I think, of what we're seeing today with North Korea, South Korea, even what happened with the USSR. But I do believe ultimately for the libertarian revolution to occur, there must be someone in the power structure who helps that coup occur. There's this myth, I think, out there that, you know, widespread social movement, you know, some of these BLM people or Antifa people think if they just get enough people out in the streets marching, the politicians are just going to cave into their demands and they're just going to go along with it. I don't think it really works that way. I think it's somebody up in the top, somebody in that power structure who says, hey, I'm going to take advantage of what's going on now to take over, institute my own sense of control, and I'll use this movement to legitimize what I'm doing and then institute it myself. But if you don't have that person in the power structure, taking advantage of the opportunity that's ahead of them, I don't think much is going to happen. So what are some of the necessary components of this libertarian revolution? I'd say really 60%, like it or not, I think it does come down to political legitimacy. You have to have leaders and organizational structure, because what are you going to do? I mean, we saw what happened. Did you guys see what the news this last week where there's this group of I don't know who they were exactly, but they fenced off, there's this national park, and they fenced it off up in the mountains, and they were claiming it as their own? It lasted like 2 days. You know what I mean? The locals start cutting the wire, and people are like, who are you? There's no political legitimacy there, right? There's no sense of like, these people have a valid claim. These people have an organization. They have a leadership. They have a structure. I do think you need that, especially in the world we're in right now. This might be talking a little bit about more of where we're at in the present system. You need that political legitimacy, and I think that's a problem that people have. They think that you can just overthrow the government somehow. It's not going to work. It's not going to work because nobody's going to see you as a legitimate, nobody's going to listen to you. Nobody's going to follow what you say. You have to have some legitimacy overall. And I think that's really the ultimate thing. 20% maybe is that popular support. The percentage of the average populace that either celebrates it or is okay with it. We get that statistic from the American Revolution. 3% of the population were active participants in the American Revolution. 20% of the population generally supported it. That's it, only 20%. It wasn't 50% plus one, 20% of the population. I'd say 15% having these private markets where the state lacks control over the markets. That's a key component of weakening the state and creating real wealth outside of the political system. And having these social leaders, your intellectual community and economic leaders who are not necessarily political leaders, but are nonetheless the people out there who are like challenging the status quo, like an Elon Musk type person. So I do say those are some of the necessary components of this libertarian revolution. I would say we do have some immediate needs if we want to see this happen, right? Leaders lighting the path, a home base, maybe that's New Hampshire, maybe it's Colorado if we're lucky. Outreach, growing the community, sharing information online. Sharing is caring for sure. Getting that information out there, exposing people to these ideas. That was me at one point. And then resources. You gotta have some lawyers, guns, and money. If you don't, you're not getting very far in this modern world we live in. So those are some of the immediate needs of this libertarian revolution. So what's it going to look like? I think the libertarian revolution will look like a community with some physical barrier where individuals have a shared identity. There will be outside support where goods are traded and travel exists. They'll have resources, specifically technology that allows them to maintain their freedom against aggressors. They will control, but they will also control who is allowed into their community, or at the very least, who can exercise political power in their community. Because if you don't have that, what's to prevent people from just moving into your community and changing things back to an authoritarian system? I don't know how you get around that. So think of social media as a tool for outreach. Many of the people in this room know each other from social media. A lot of people, that's why you're here. So there's super value there. So ultimately, I think liberty will win, but only if we fight for it. You can choose your own adventure, but choose you must. And I want to end with this quote from Murray Rothbard. He was a great libertarian theorist and economist. He said, quote, "Most people, when they hear the word revolution, think immediately and only of direct acts of physical confrontation with the state, raising barricades in the streets, battling a cop, storming the Bastille or other government buildings. But this is only one small part of the revolution. Revolution is a mighty, complex, long-run process, a complicated movement with many vital parts and functions. It is the pamphleteer writing in his study. It is the journalist, the political club, the agitator, the organizer, the campus activist, the theoretician, the philanthropist. It is all of this and much more. Each person and group has its part to play in this great, complex movement." So what will the libertarian revolution look like? I think it'll be slow progress and then all at once. So thank you very much, everybody.
Questions?
Okay, so by definition, it's been tough to get libertarians to come together. They're often, like to say, on their property and away from people. We've seen an attack on religion from the left in kind of this Marxian playbook of, discrediting religion so that there is no higher power. When you go through all this stuff and see a future, do you see a role for religion in being able to help these libertarians get together, or do you think it'll kind of hinder it in any way?
Maybe, and that's a great point. I actually was thinking a lot about how different groups exist now. There's certain subcultures in our country and across the world that exist outside of state power. Think of, for example, the Mormons in Utah, or the Mormons historically, having their own community, their own government, right? Their own sense of what they're going to do. They don't care what the federal government says. They're going to live their own life. So religion can be a tool to bring people together. But it really comes down to that common identity, right? Why don't libertarians get together? Because maybe they don't see the other person as part of their community. They don't feel that they're part of that community. They don't have an identity that they share with those other people. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. That's why I was harping on it so much. Because if you don't have that, if you don't have a belief that we're in this together, like, why should I listen to this guy? You know, this guy over here, he's doing all these crazy things, but hey, you know, I disagree with him on a specific piece of tax policy. So why should I follow along with what he has to say? That's a libertarian argument, right? We're going to fight over this minutia instead of realizing the bigger goal. So there's an opportunity there. I think it comes down to leadership, ultimately. If you have the right leader, I mean, how many people in our society, in our country, in the liberty community, global, you know, nationally, if Ron Paul got up there and said, hey guys, July 4th this year, or maybe because the banks are closed, but July 3rd this year, everybody pull as much money out of the bank as you can. We're going to create one of the biggest bank protests in human history to show that these people are done manipulating our money. You have a true leader who has a clear call to action, has a real sense of what they're going to accomplish, then you can have people acting in concert. But unless you have clear leadership, clear goals, and a vision, you're not going to have people acting in concert together. You're not going to be able to herd those cats. And maybe religion could be a tool for that. If you have a specific religion that are all there, you know, group of libertarians that all belong to that specific religion and they're being persecuted, it could be a great opportunity.
Other than the American Revolution, what revolution do you think was the most successful and why?
The cultural revolution that we're living in the throes of right now. I mean, you look at what's going on, people are having to go to, who was talking about going to DEI classes earlier and having to be subjected to all these different types of ideas and identity politics everywhere we turn, right? No matter what you're doing, you're seeing division by race, gender, whatever you want to call it, class. I think that's the cultural revolution. It's how you divide and conquer the people. Make everybody a victim and then say, hey, I'm going to help, you're a victim, I'm going to help you out. Follow what I have to say. I think that's the most successful thing we're seeing, and we got to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, I wanted to make two comments on the idea of religion groups that are bonding people together. I found out that, for instance, Jewish community, for example, they have their own internal courts, and they refuse to go to the state to settle their own disagreement. Otherwise, you're out of the community. And I think it's a great example. Even for medical care, they have their own system. They don't go through this insurance that we have. The other comment I want to make, I think one point that I think it's missing, and it's particularly true in the United States, is that as so far, I think the history is still on our side. And to make a couple of examples, again, there was no income tax in 100 and something years ago, or how people used to live without Medicare and Medicaid. And I found out that doctors had a moral obligation to help people that didn't have money. Otherwise, other doctors would come and spit on your door as a sign that you didn't fulfill your duty. Those are fascinating stories. There was not a Department of Justice before Ulysses Grant. They paid a lawyer. So I do think, like, it's not a utopia. That's how it used to be. And one of the things that I think the talk could use a lot is history is still on our side. I don't know for how long, but I think it's an important message.
That's extremely important. And touch on your first topic. I think I love that idea, right? There's a sense of community within a lot of Jewish groups, right? And they have their entire system existing outside of the state. They don't participate at all on the state level. They have their own courts or their own systems. I think if anybody's read The Godfather, it's another perfect example of how the mafia, they just do the things on their own. They have their own internal system of how justice is dispensed, who's taking care of what, and there's rules, there's obligations, there's a system and a code that exists within it. So ultimately, maybe the mafia is a good example for what the libertarian revolution could look like. You have these groups of people acting outside of state power, and maybe it's centered around a religion or an ideal, or maybe it's centered around money and greed, like maybe the mafia. I don't know. But I think those are very good points, and the key of the past, right? How much freedom we used to have. We didn't have passports to travel. We didn't have all of these things. We could buy a machine gun over the mail, 40 years ago. I mean, how amazing is that? So there's truth in that. And it needs to be recognized and celebrated ultimately.
So touching on something like elite theory, do you see any viable billionaires that are sympathetic to our cause? Is someone like Elon more on our side, or is he coattailing for federal subsidies?
I wish, I hope, probably not. You know, he's a defense contractor. He makes most of his money off of the federal government through SpaceX. I mean, who's paying him? It's Department of Defense, it's NASA, it's these other types of people. You know, his subsidies for Tesla, it's from the Department of Energy. It's from taxpayer subsidies. I mean, he's living on the dole. He's become rich by, you know, doing that. And I don't fault him for it, don't get me wrong. Hopefully, maybe we get somebody like him, or Jack Dorsey was tweeting about Rothbard a while back. You get some of these people out there. I mean, building a community of people who are those billionaires, these oligarchs, maybe that's where a lot of hope should be placed, you know, and putting libertarians in powerful positions and elevating them and creating this new leadership class of libertarians and putting them in that place as much as possible. You know, you think about it's a tactic used by other groups, right? You're in group hiring. You think about, you know, you hear that about with like the Masons or Yale or Harvard. Hey, this guy went to Yale, I went to Yale, I'm going to hire him over anybody else. It doesn't matter. We're part of the club, we're part of this group, right? Having that sense for libertarians where you say, hey, they're a libertarian, they're moving in here, and we're going to start building something. And those are the people that are going to become wealthy and leaders, and they're going to become the new elite. And that's a viable strategy, I think. And Elon, time will tell, but I don't know.
Thank you for your presentation. It's quite impressive, but I believe you missed several parts, and the most important is the approach of compartmentalization of society, or maybe say regarding that every community can have completely different rules, as like private discrimination. So if you have something like that, you can bring completely opposite parts of society to your support. For example, like white racist and completely people of color. Like people who believe in God and completely does not consume even alcohol, and people who want to all drugs be legalized. How to do it? You should allow every county create their own rights. For example, in this county, you cannot sell any drugs, including alcohol. And in different community, you can do anything as you want regarding the drugs. And the only rule, you should allow any member of you to leave this community when you have it. So this approach allows people to bring all of these teams, allows them to communicate with each other, to be to trust friends. So right now we have a mixed community with people different world views fight each other. And if we allow to people to be slightly okay, I believe you missed this important point.
That's a very important point. You're 100% right. And there's a big question. I mean, that's one of the bigger questions in our world today. Can you have diversity and freedom? Yes. You know what I mean? Because if you have people who are good, you agree with them on 90% of things, but they don't want you to have a gun, or they don't want you to smoke marijuana, or they don't want you to drink alcohol, and that's their issue, their sticking issue, and you say, no, I'm going to do it no matter what, well, then what do you do? What do you do? Maybe all at the same time or one after the other, but what are you going to do, right? So, no, I think you're right, and that's why I brought the slide back, this idea of decentralization or secession, where you have communities of like-minded individuals carving their own path and making their own identity. And that's ultimately maybe what it comes down to, this idea of, hey, down in Colorado Springs, they have this, like, maybe for lack of a better, a stereotype, this Christian conservative community where they're going to outlaw marijuana, they're going to do what they want here, but then but they have all guns and they have all of these types of things and whatever they do. And then you have downtown Denver where everybody's doing fentanyl or whatever, and it's totally allowed, but you can't have a gun because everybody's on fentanyl, or whatever. So I mean, that is a viable path, I think, to how to create a libertarian society. Is it's not going to happen widespread, right? It's going to happen in pockets for the most part. Because it's identity, it's shared values. How do you have a shared cultural value around things you fundamentally disagree on? It's nearly impossible. So that's a really key component, and I'm glad you brought it up. Thank you.
Hey, real quick, I wanted to ask about, you mentioned Javier Milei a little bit ago. It took the right person at the right time to really do what he's done in Argentina. I guess my question is, how do you identify when it's the right time, when it's the right place and time to make that libertarian move? And really, is it just kind of a shot in the dark, hope it sticks, or is there like a real strategy that we can really get behind to pick and choose those right moments to really advance liberty? Because if he would have done it even 4 years, 5 years before he did what he did, nobody would really know who Javier Milei is today.
For Free State Colorado, one of the biggest mottos there is fight where you can win. So find the opportunities that you have in front of you, right? So like we were saying, maybe if we're going to fight a political battle in Denver, it's about a different issue than what you're fighting up in rural Weld County, right? You fight where you can win on those issues. So I know it's not a perfect answer to your question, but nonetheless, you do your best to recognize the environment you're in. Find those issues, right? If right now inflation, the cost of living is the biggest issue here in Colorado. If you're running for office, focus on that issue and fight on that issue. And we have a chance to improve our economic liberty because that issue is affecting us. Maybe during George Floyd time, it was criminal justice was the hottest issue around. People were passing criminal justice legislation left and right. What an opportunity for a libertarian activist to present ending qualified immunity or doing something else that's going to, so you have to read the room, right? You can't immediately go out and say, hey, we want to decriminalize every single drug in society, Mark, when people are dying on the street here in Denver over fentanyl overdoses or whatever, right? You have to respond to the time you're in, right? Like you're saying, oh my gosh, this Venezuelan gang issue is getting out of control. Every post I see on Twitter is all about it. Hey, well, this is a great time to talk about how we should open the borders and, bring in as many Venezuelan gang members as we can possibly, right? Like people are going to be like, you're crazy, So you got to respond to the environment that you're given. You got to fight where you can win and look for the opportunities where they're at. But I think a key component is building the organizational structure. I did an interview with John Caldera. Check it out. I asked him, I said, what happened to Colorado? Why has the left taken over Colorado? And he says, because they have long-term thinking. They're building institutions and organizations. They're building political infrastructure 20, 30 years in advance. On the right, the Republicans, they don't do that. They get caught up in the cult of a personality. And then after that election cycle's over, they're done and they move on to the next thing. Where the left is spending 20, 30 years building an institution and they have all these little NGOs and nonprofits and all these different organizations across Colorado that as soon as a candidate runs, they already have dozens of volunteers. They have hundreds of donors. They have thousands of people on social media who are willing to push that message out there because they've built that infrastructure. So I think there's two key components to it. Recognizing when the opportunity exists and then working behind the scenes and building that for when that moment strikes, right? Sharpen your knife until that tree's ready to come down.
I'd like to piggyback a little bit on something you said earlier. There are significant organizations that are outside of the state currently. They're called cartels. And have you ever looked into the revolutions that happened in Latin America and the subsequent societies and cultures that they created?
No, not really, but I'm extremely curious and interested. I mean, I hear about the Pablo Escobar types and these people who all of a sudden get massive amounts of money and power, and what do they do to try and take over the political system? I think it's extremely interesting, and maybe a guide or and some lesson, right? So and that's part of this idea of this collapsed society, right? Preparing. All of a sudden, what if our society collapses? Well, oh my gosh, we have all these cartels and these criminal organizations who are going to immediately start extorting the population. They're going to become a mini government, extorting the population, controlling behavior, controlling who comes in and out of which neighborhood. And we see it in failed cities and failed states all the time, where these, maybe in Russia, where this Russian mob, boom, the state fell. Okay, the mob says, here's our time, here's our opportunity. We're going to become the new government, play by our own rules, but they had that organizational infrastructure in place already to take advantage of that. So who in the libertarian side is building that infrastructure and that organizational system to take advantage of when something bad happens, right? It's a great question, and it's key. I think that's key.
Man, I'm disappointed. I came here thinking you were going to go over the Benstone, points, the sedition, subversion, and sabotage. You should download the book if you haven't read it. I was looking for stuff to sabotage, man. You didn't list any. Seriously, in everything that you said, it's really clear that there's a progression and we have to put in some effort. But I like the idea of having some sort of ratchet where once you've established some sort of win, there's no way for the elites to, ratchet it back. And do you have any ideas about like what we could do in terms of all the points you touched?
Yeah, I think some of it's the incremental wins, like marijuana. You're not gonna recriminalize marijuana now. I mean, when people's pocketbooks are affected, right? All of a sudden, everybody's getting rich off of cryptocurrency, and people with political power are wealthy on cryptocurrency. Good luck trying to regulate it, because people who have access to the political means of power, who have their hands on the lever, have an incentive to not go backwards. So I think creating an incentive structure for the people who have power to follow through is a good way to ratchet that forward. And I appreciate your talk on Ben Stone. I've listened to that, the audiobook version of it. I've had it basically, it's great about subverting and sabotaging the state and trying to destroy the system, but ultimately it's lacking, because we can talk about all day how easy it is to tear things down, right? We've seen that since 2020. We've seen riots. We've seen people smashing things and destroying statues. It's easy to tear things down. And yeah, if you're under occupation from some Nazi government or whatever, fine, act in some partisan resistant movement. But ultimately, what then? What then? Right? There has to be something afterwards, or else there's no win. There's no win in the long term. So I appreciate your comment there, JD. But yeah, creating incentives, economic incentives where greed is going to help you ratchet. People are getting rich off the free market. People are getting rich. That's a lot of the reason why people say like the actual physical cash isn't going to disappear, because there's too many advantages for people in power to launder money, to buy drugs, to do whatever it is they do, untraceable. Hey, the advantage is there for them. We get to have that advantage as well.
3 more questions.
Hey, as you were given your historical presentation on failed and successful revolutions, the libertarian angle, a dimension occurred to me, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with the distinction between voice and exit when it comes to this sort of topic, right? That there's like fundamentally 2 different categories of behavior. There's voice, where you try to reform, you change the system, you involve in you integrate in the system, and then there's exit behaviors, where you cannot use voice effectively, right? You can't reform effectively, and so now you look for other solutions. And it occurs to me that the, American War of Independence and other, let's say, libertarian related movements, Gulch and the Free State Project type of things, they really feel more like exit than voice, right? Like you could look at the French Revolution, Russian Revolution. These are all voice type revolutions. They just change the government with a new type or a new form. The American Revolution, maybe some of the Latin American revolutions were more exit really than voice themed. So I'm wondering if you can, speak to this, or if you've thought about that angle in terms of successful, measures for us. Maybe there's always going to be some dimension of voice, because there's always a fire to put out. But I'm curious, if you think we should be weighing our decisions more on an exit strategy basis.
Definitely an idea. I appreciate you bringing that up. It's definitely an idea I've grappled with a lot. I hear it every single day on social media. Colorado's lost. I'm leaving Colorado. I'm moving to Wyoming. I'm going to Indiana. I'm leaving this place. This place is too bad. It's terrible. And those are the exiters, right? That's their idea, their strategy of I'm getting the heck out of here. They don't see an opportunity for reform. The idea of what I'm trying to do with Free State Colorado is basically, no, we have a voice. There's things we can do. We can still work within the system. We can have incremental wins. I think there's true opportunity there, but it is something to grapple with and something to understand that, hey, you could get past the point of no return. I mean, I don't know if I might be alone here, but I thought that was going to happen during COVID potentially. Not to sound too paranoid, when they started opening up a field hospital here at the convention center, and I was like, well, who is that going to be for? There's helicopters flying over the night sky, and they're locking people up, and you better not be found outside. Whoa, if you wanted to start going after political dissidents, this would be a great opportunity to do so. Round them up, take them there. Oh, sorry, family, they died of COVID. They died of COVID. There's nothing we can do about it. Who knows what really happened? They tortured you to death or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, you got to be prepared. Who was it that said gold, guns, and a getaway plan? Those are some of the ideas to create a free society. If you're wealthy, you're free no matter where you live. If you're one of the wealthiest people in any society, any state, any country, you're going to be fine pretty much no matter what, in my perspective, for the most part. You have guns to defend yourself, but you have a getaway plan just in case, because you never know, right? I mean, that's why I was born and raised in Jefferson County. I'm up in Weld County now because I said I'm getting the hell out of Jeffco and Denver metro area with all the crap that's been going on these last 4 years.
So you exited from the Denver area, but you're still exercising voice within the larger Colorado political system.
Yeah, strategic relocation, I think, is not necessarily a bad strategy. That's the whole idea behind the Free State Project as well, or like these other communities. Part of what I want to do with future Free State Colorado is create a welcome guide. Hey, if you're a libertarian moving to the state, here's some places you should consider moving to first. Here are the most libertarian communities if you care about these specific issues. Then move here and try and reinforce those cultural values, and we can make some progress at that micro level in the community level. So I think there's valid objects there, but that's a really interesting perspective. I'm glad you brought it up.
This was great, and first I want to compliment you on having the best slides I have seen in all of the years of coming to Liberty on the Rocks. God bless you, Brandon. God bless you. But my point is there are two issues that weren't brought up, and you can only do so much in a program. You never mentioned the word entrepreneurship, and you didn't talk about choice. I consider myself an entrepreneurial libertarian, meaning that I try to support the idea of creating businesses, and if you want to call them nonprofits, which is just an invention of the IRS, but agencies, organizations, and so on, but also being able to make them successful. I want there to be a cultural stereotype when someone says libertarian, say, oh, libertarians, they're so great at creating small businesses. You want to have a successful business, hire a libertarian, right? And there are people out there, we mentioned the Mormons, for example. When you think of Mormons, you say, oh, good, the society they created, great businesses. Or you think of certain cultural groups like the Cubans and the Koreans. Oh, good, if you want a good business, look at these small business people here. So that's something I think is really important as part of this revolution we're talking about.
110%, Pat. Really appreciate that. I think you're completely right. You know, if it's part of that identity and that culture. If there was a culture of, you know, they're part of a libertarian community where people are entrepreneurial, they're responsible people, they show up to work on time, they're going to work hard, they think outside the box, they're not just going to follow orders, and they're good at creating things and building things. Then yeah, that's out-competing our enemies, and ultimately that's one of the best ways to win, is if you're able to produce more wealth, more children, more success than your enemies are, ultimately.
Oh, I'm not going to be
Yeah. Don't know what to say to that, but yeah, no, completely. It's a good point. Entrepreneurial mindset, for sure.
Last question. If tomorrow you had $1 billion and you were the libertarian George Soros, how would you structure your donations and spending to build this liberty infrastructure that you've talked about?
Well, I got 35 more slides if you want to go over that. Yeah, no, 100%. It's something I think about all the time. Believe me, this is my passion when I'm not working. This is all I really focus on, is this political battle. And I think there's so much opportunity. I mean, I have specific strategies, right? Find the others. I think that's huge. You know, Isaiah's job, I think that was Chodoroff, or I can't remember which author wrote about that, but find the others. So find and support other libertarians in the community. If you can build those people up and give them the resources and make them famous and make them celebrities, they're cultural leaders, they're icons. I think that'd be one of the key things. Find the others. Fight where you can win. Find those political battles. Say, oh my gosh, look at the political climate. It's perfect for Javier Milei, or it's perfect for legalizing marijuana, or it's perfect for decriminalizing machine guns. Whatever's going on, look for those opportunities. But ultimately, copy what the left has done to take over Colorado. I'd build a network of organizations focused on single issues that all coordinate outside of political campaigns to elect the right people and shift the culture in a certain way. You know, maybe create my own 9 News so Kyle Clark doesn't have control over the minds of these wonderful, lovely people in our state, but create a media organization, try and control the narrative, try and build a political infrastructure, find the other people that you can support, and do what you can. I mean, $1 billion would probably go pretty quick doing those kind of things.
That's our talk. Give it up for Brandon Wark.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.